Hi everyone, and welcome to this third episode of Women in Blockchain and AI that we host with Furt'Her. The goal of this podcast is to give space and a voice to women who are in this industry. And today we have the pleasure to host Inbar Preiss with us. And Inbar has been covering as a reporter in different magazines. Around the field of policy, regulatory, intellectual property. So I will ask you, Inbar, to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what drove you into that space and what is your link with your profession into that space.
Thank you so much, Lorena. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I can tell you that I indeed am working as a journalist for the past several years already on several topics. I've been focusing a lot, as you mentioned, on EU regulation and policy, but also have been covering a lot of developments in crypto and blockchain since about 2017 or so. So that's where I first started writing. And it's been really interesting to see the space develop and really see different narratives and trends go up and down. But I've been kind of on and off, in and out of crypto and blockchain space. Currently, I'm working with MLex as a senior correspondent on intellectual property. So I guess my link to the space is always an interest in how technology really impacts society, companies, and how these kind of developments are meeting. There's on one hand new technologies, and then on the other hand, there's existing regulatory and political systems, and the way they meet is not always smooth. So that's where it's fun to report about these kind of clashes and conflicts.
And this is what triggers you. This is why you started to investigate into those topics. It's to see how it would fit with the current frameworks and how it and what impact would have those innovations.
I mean, that's something that definitely interests me. For example, the stories I like writing the most are, the ones that show, where I'm able to bridge the two worlds. So, for example, there's a legal structure, and then there's a very innovative technology. And, for example, the story of Tornado Cash, a crypto mixer that, is designed to protect financial privacy on Ethereum, which otherwise has all the history of the transactions visible. But then, the US put sanctions on it, all the developers are arrested and, going through trials. So there's a kind of misunderstanding, I think, between what regulators believe the story is, what the crypto industry, or at least privacy advocates, believe the story is. And it's very interesting to see both sides trying to make the story become one. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but yes.
That's very interesting what you say. And how do you manage to remain neutral and objective while studying this and being able to have the views of the people in the space, building the space, and from the regulatory space, or the how do you manage to remain neutral and provide an objective view on it?
So, well, I think first of all, I do want to highlight the importance of at least professionally remaining as objective as possible, because that's how you build up a reputation and a reliability as a journalist, because otherwise you're only talking to one side and you're missing the other side. So it's very important to make sure you talk to everyone, all the sides which have some stake in the game, listen to their view, what they understand and what they might wish the other side or the other kind of argument is presenting. So yeah, definitely need to talk to everyone. It's not my role to say what's right or what's wrong
No,
in
of
these kind of
course.
stories, but it's my role to present all the facts as clearly as possible, as easy to understand as possible, and then let the reader make their own decision. So that's where I try to how I try to approach these kind of stories.
Okay, great. It's good to hear because we have seen that there is a lot of bad press about the industry. So, and sometimes, as you said, it can lead to misunderstanding to what are the intention of the builders. And I've just seen a post online that about digital freedom. that there is something to be signed, that there is a paper to be signed. And it was saying it's not because builders are trying to protect privacy that they're like against the system. And so trying to protect values in the technological world, in the digital world, is something that we have to understand as well. That is not against some entities, but it's also to protect the rights of the people. So what's your view on that?
Yeah, this is definitely an interesting topic. I think I know what you're referring to. And yeah, I think the interesting part again in this junction between crypto specifically and regulatory systems is that crypto comes with a certain range of philosophies. I don't think it's just one single philosophy, but there is definitely different movements within the blockchain industry and crypto that are very, determined that the technology is used with a certain purpose to protect privacy, to allow for, I guess, in what some people say financial freedom or financial independence, and kind of providing tools that are not reliant on the existing financial systems. Um, so I think that's where regulators get, they have a hard time because all the boxes that exist in order to provide market integrity, to provide consumer protection, all these things which are also very important if you want to make a certain technology mainstream. That how do all these things fit together?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's where the kind of ethical part is difficult because technology is technology, it's not right or wrong, it's not good or bad, it's how it's used. And then that's where ethics come in, and then you need to rely on regulators to share a certain ethical background. I don't know, it's complicated.
Yeah, and this is why I also wanted to ask you, while you are interviewing and searching on those topics, how do you feel that the institutions are well equipped or not about the understanding of what would be coming as innovation, and how to make the frameworks evolve if there is any upgrades into the use of the internet with decentralization or other.
So in terms of regulatory bodies being equipped to handle new technologies, I mean, yeah, it's definitely a concern that I've heard industry raise many times in many different fields, not just in blockchain. It's up to the regulator to take the responsibility to, provide education, to hire the right people, to prepare for new laws that are being implemented. So when it comes to the markets and crypto assets regulation, there's a certain timeline in between when the regulation comes into force and when it is actually applying and in effect, so to speak. So there's various phases in which it kicks in. And we often talk about how these phases are a moment for the crypto companies to comply with all these rules, but it's also a time for regulators to prepare to oversee the industry. So it's a moment that they need to in-house decide who's going to work on what, how are you going to understand the industry that you're regulating, what is within purview, what is not in scope. So these are all kind of issues um, that are interesting to look at as the timeline gets closer and closer for the full implementation of MiCA. So some elements are already in force, some
Yes.
will still be coming into force next year onwards. Each country in the EU can still choose how much time they want to give.
And have you seen or have you heard like what the impact was of the already enforced part of Mika?
So the part of MiCA which is being enforced first is the part on stablecoins.
Yes.
So that came into force, I think, less than a year ago. So I mean, it's a lot of different provisions. Again, I haven't been covering this as closely lately because I'm
No.
focusing on property, but um, there's a lot of provisions that I think are interesting to look at. Again, at that what we mentioned in the beginning, the fact that these regulations are kind of built with the traditional financial institutions
Yeah.
in mind and not necessarily fully adapted, although Mika does really try to adapt some parts to crypto and blockchain technology specifically. It's still, especially for the regulators, which are now responsible for drafting the implementation details, so kind of the details of how exactly this is going to work. Um, they're overseeing different kinds of institutions, really, investment funds or insurances and all these different kind of traditional institutions. Um, so where was I going with this? It's interesting to see how um, they're going to really handle these issues. But for stablecoins specifically, I was also going to add that, some of the provisions in MiCA mean that I think there's, certain reserves
Yeah.
that a stablecoin needs to have in a traditional bank or in a group of
Mm.
banks, depends on how big the market cap of the stablecoin is. And that's a really interesting provision because crypto was originally designed to be independent from the financial institution, and now these provisions are kind of bringing it back like, no, 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 we cannot be fully independent. You have to have a certain amount actually in a traditional bank.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't apply in the EU and it has no space. So, for example, one of the biggest stablecoins, Tether,
Yeah.
is kind of backing out of the EU because it's not going to comply with these regulations.
Yeah, they should have reserves as well, but they're not being audited. So properly, I would say they say they are, but um, it's difficult to have some transparency on the reserve. But indeed, that goes a little, it takes a little further the industry for their native mindset of decentralization, because then again, it's a centralized private entity holding the coins, so and having the reserve, so it's again like a central entity. So yes, indeed, that's steering away from what a full decentralization is. But let's see if that will be possible to develop full decentralization models. It's something that needs to be experimented, and that it's still under development. I have not seen something breakthrough really already. So, and it's a shift also in the mindset and in the infrastructure of the web, but also in the mindset. So it's something, and as you said, for the moment, Mika is applying those rules as if they're trying to regulate to protect the users, and but they regulate the third parties, they regulate the exchanges. The decentralized finance cannot be regulated per se, so that's something also to understand. So they regulate what they can, so the actors in the middle, um, to protect the users. And yes, that's something very interesting. And what I wanted to ask you again, um, I wanted to ask you, yes, because you said that you focus as well on intellectual property. And that's something very interesting, because in this digital world where we have an amazing and explosion of data, it's more than ever a big question, like how to protect intellectual property online. And I was wondering, like, what are you covering while researching on this topic, and what have you seen? What are the trends that you see?
Yes, it's definitely interesting, especially I like seeing kind of the way these technologies are working together or the potential where they might still work together in the future. So indeed, AI is now, one of the biggest topics
Which
globally.
one?
AI,
Ah, yeah, yeah,
artificial
yes. Yeah.
intelligence. Um, so yeah, I think AI right now is serving as, this serving widely now as a tool for curation and for relaying this kind of huge amount of data and information. And then blockchain is a kind of technology that is showing how this data is historically coming from. So it's showing um, the kind of the provenance and the origins of data or transactions. And this is kind of the characteristics of blockchain of being immutable. So you cannot change what has already happened on the ledger. And I think this is a good combination because, AI is showing the data in different ways, and it kind of brings a whole melting pot of everything it's scraping from the internet. And then blockchain kind of solves the issue of the origin of the data. So this is where intellectual property comes in because there's so many lawsuits at the moment between publishers, so organizations or companies that are holding intellectual property rights for artists, for creators, for different creative works, essentially. And so on one hand, there's these publishers or right holders, and then there's the AI platforms, because AI platforms are, of course, using all this data, materials, and works to train their models. And these publishers, which hold intellectual property rights, are alleging that the AI platforms are not paying licenses. They're not paying the royalty fees that the artists or the creators deserve, and they're using their creative works without, you know, without a legal right. So these are some of, the kind of issues that are happening
And have you
in
seen a case already closing, or it's still ongoing because it's more recent?
many of these are still ongoing. So in the case in the UK High Court between Getty Images and Stability AI, actually quite recently, Stability AI won the case. So that means that the AI platform will not be forced to address all these claims from creators, which is, definitely a significant ruling. But there's been a lot of other cases between, for example, I've covered some German kind of collecting societies, and those are organizations that collect copyrights on behalf of artists that
Okay.
have sued also OpenAI and other AI platforms like Suno AI. So these are cases that are ongoing, and we'll see where they lead. And of course, there's also a whole series of appeals that can still take place and change the outcome. So that's definitely interesting. But to continue on this, intersection of IP, AI, and blockchain, it's interesting because I don't see this now quite yet. I'm sure there's, different projects looking at it, but blockchain can be used to ensure transparency in ownership of records, kind of ensure royalty payments, for, to facilitate this bridge between AI platforms and right holders, and, maybe even some companies going to figure out how to automate transactions via smart contracts between, the publishers and the AI companies. So there's a lot of opportunities for, these different areas to come together.
No, definitely. And this is something I also gave a presentation yesterday about. It's how both technologies can work together and help each other in their strength and also in their weaknesses. And indeed, if you have the blockchain technology who can tamper-proof the data and make sure that we can distinguish from what is native and what is artificial, it's also something that can be addressed. And AI can also, while the data is being recorded on a blockchain in a distributed ledger, AI can come on top of it to oversee the data and predict trends. So it's also a way where those two technologies can converge. And it's also interesting that AI can be the big brother of blockchain while watching over what's happening around the transaction, that it can detect frauds as well, failures, and like in real time, like have a notification and have an agent, maybe an AI agent doing like a stop on the transaction. So it's very interesting how it can be combined, and how the fact that its data would be distributed and not centralized would also have another kind of value and not being held into one entity. Um, so that's very interesting, but it's a total change of infrastructure. So it's something that has to be considered as well, because once the data is coming in the blockchain, it's immutable, so we cannot delete it. And if you don't filter the data that comes in, you could register on the blockchain a wrong law or something miswritten, something. And that's one of the limitations that blockchain has, is that you have to be careful with what you input. Um, and yes, so that's something, but it can definitely help to certify data, to distinguish data, and to have the origin traced, and also like to follow up on the different transactions, because the challenge of AI on the other side is that we don't understand fully how sometimes the automation goes, because we have built
Mhm.
those very complex systems with different models being combined, and there is this black box effect that no one knows, like sometimes what the AI will predict or will do. So with blockchain you can retrace the decision of AI and understand where it went wrong. So that's also very interesting in the combination of both. um, but in terms of
Yeah,
crypto, yes,
absolutely.
I don't have much experience. So that's your expertise.
Yes, exactly.
It's
But yeah, no, it's definitely interesting how to you know, these things will develop in the future. And it's also interesting because I think it's a lot of, for me and for you, it's interesting to look at it. But for many people, this will just be things in the background. You don't need to
true.
know, like, for example, how the internet works, as long as it does the right thing for you to get through your day. And for those, the nerds that want to know how it works, they can code and do it. But for most people, they don't need to know.
Yes.
So
But I feel
it's
like
cool.
that there is, like, in this shift, there is something about users, because since the decentralization puts the responsibility back to the users, it's a distributed ledger. So there is a kind of, even like for cookie management, I interviewed like a friend who has this project at the EU level to decentralize cookie management with EU centralized cloud, so to keep the sovereignty of data in Europe. And but she says, so the user would need to select what type of content he wants to see instead of giving the consent away. But then the user needs to take back the responsibility. So I feel like even though they won't see it, they will feel it. You know?
Yeah, that's a
You know?
good point. That's a good point. I mean, the hopes is that, Web3, as I understand it, it's rather than moving of like between one side publisher, other side user, is that these lines are a little bit more blurred, and then users can actually own their data and decide what happens with it and who gets access to it. So that's really, I think, the moment where hopefully also ethically, kind of taking back a bit of the agency for users, that now data is being sold on their behalf left and
Yeah.
right. So
Indeed, it's precious. Data is precious and it's being monetized. We will see how it will evolve, if there is any other business model that will break through. But it's interesting. And I wanted to ask you, in your job, is there any areas that are most being looked at currently? What are
what
the trendy topics that you need to address for the moment?
in intellectual property?
Yes?
So I guess one of the hottest topics in this world is what is called standard essential patents. And these are the kind of the inventions that are necessary to connect between different devices. So the reason that maybe my laptop connects to the Wi-Fi in my house, but it would also connect to the Wi-Fi in China, or I can call a Samsung telephone from my iPhone and they still connect over 4G. All these kinds of really basic things are possible because the patents are standard. So every technology needs to stick to the same kinds of kind of areas, same kind of standards essentially, and that's why they work. So, for example, um, in Europe, Nokia and Ericsson own a lot of this technology. So they used to be maybe more famous for manufacturing phones and selling phones, but now their main business model is actually owning the intellectual property and then licensing it out to companies like Apple, like Samsung, that then are paying for the licenses to use this technology to make sure that everything is actually working together seamlessly
So
and
it's
all these different
private,
devices.
yeah, it's private tech companies taking care of that. It's not governments.
It's not governments, it's private tech companies, and then there's certain like um, international bodies that are facilitating the work on the technology. So, for example, now 6G
Yeah.
is being slowly getting to the point where these standard essential patents are being created. And then that's meant to be a very apolitical, let's say, process that there's a bunch of engineers in a room and they're figuring out the best solutions. And they're coming from all these different companies, from Huawei, from Qualcomm, from Ericsson, from Nokia, from whatever, all these different companies that are specialized in these kinds of technologies, and then they develop and immediately file for intellectual property rights over this technology.
Okay.
And then the problem with these companies that own, such an important technology that all these other companies that are providing phones or Wi-Fi or routers, whatever, is that they have a monopoly over the market.
Okay.
So there needs to be certain rules about how to make sure that these companies that own the technology and own the IP are not abusing their power.
Okay.
So there's a lot of issues in courts. It's an endless like litigation between companies that own the standard essential patents and the companies that are using and implementing
Okay.
them.
Wow.
So
I
that's
didn't know.
that's
Yeah.
a fun part, a fun part of my job.
Wow, you're covering that. That's amazing. And is there any regulation around that? Like,
That's another very sticky topic. So actually, the EU has been working for 2 years on standard essential patents regulation, and it was actually supposed to be withdrawn. So the EU Commission, in its efforts to, the new Commission was brought into place at the beginning of the year, and they decided that in light of geopolitical shifts and the role of the US and the Trump presidency, so on, the EU needs to be a bit more competitive. And the regulation in the EU is stopping companies from really, taking off in the way that they do in other markets. So in this kind of wave, the regulation that was being supported, being drafted on standard essential patents, was withdrawn. And this regulation was already extremely controversial because the companies like Ericsson, like Nokia, that own these standard essential patents, they hated it. They've been lobbying against it because it makes their life a bit harder.
yeah.
It makes it less valuable to do the work that they do. But then all the other companies that are using these kinds of technologies. So on the one hand, there's like Microsoft, Apple, Samsung, but then also all the smaller SMEs companies.
Yeah.
They are very much in favor of it. Also, the car industry is extremely in favor of this regulation because they need to be able to connect all these technologies together. So anyway, that's like one of the most contentious things that I'm covering. But this regulation has a few more months until the EU Commission can officially decide whether or not it's going to cancel it completely. It's listening to lawmakers and EU member states at the moment to
Yeah.
see what their opinions are. It's also a little bit divisive at the moment, so we'll see what happens by the
I
summer.
know. Since listening to this is very interesting, like, what's your take on between Europe being known for regulating a lot, but in also protecting users, but regulating a lot, and innovation lacking in Europe? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting topic, and people are very, feel very strongly about this. So Brussels definitely has a tendency to have this ambition to be the first to regulate in a certain industry. We've seen that with MiCA for the markets and crypto assets regulation. We've seen that with GDPR. We've seen it with the AI Act. And the idea is kind of, to have this Brussels effect, which is the term that's been used over the past 10 years, that Brussels and the EU regulates, and then the rest of the world has to fall in line if they still want to market to, the EU market. So whether or not this is effective is very much in debate at the moment because this strategy to some degree is being kind of blown back in the EU's face, because now we're seeing, all the EU executives and the Commission trying to cut out as much of this red tape as possible in hopes of competing with markets like the US and
Yeah,
China
that's
and,
the thing
this.
because yeah, we are quite dependent on their innovation because we have been like regulating a lot and it's been challenging to innovate here in Europe. So that's okay, it's something that is you see that is being addressed.
Startups Yeah, for venture capital, it's much tougher in Europe. For startups, it's hard to really bootstrap here, or, a company might be able to get a good start, but then they're also capped
Ah, yeah. Mhm.
at a certain point. So and then, if they see a certain amount of success, they're like, okay, let's go to a different market and expand there. So it's definitely an issue that I think the EU is aware of and is trying to see. Let's see what happens with the next few years where things go.
And do you think it's also due to the complexity of being as the EU Union, like having like so many member states and needing to collaborate with so many actors, I would say, like member states?
Um, yeah, yeah. I mean that's definitely, the EU is complex, definitely. And it's there's only certain issues that really need, full unanimous agreement from member states. Most of the time, it's, there's different kinds of majority within EU jargon. Um, but I think the EU cares a lot about regulation and that they're able to pass a lot more laws than, for example, in the US, because, I think getting bipartisan support in the US um, is really difficult.
Hmm.
Not they're not as efficient in passing laws as the EU. If that's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean,
Yeah.
not so much for me to say. But it's different ways of approaching lawmaking. And then, you see Trump kind of going ahead with executive orders rather than, going through the whole process
Mm.
in Congress. So,
Yeah.
is that the way it should work? Probably not. Is the EU, on one hand, is overly complex, but on the other hand, it does rulemaking in a very efficient way from my experience looking at some other jurisdictions, but not all.
Yeah, and the fact is that it's an industry that is going very fast, and while we have these good institutions, they're also very slow because they have to consult on many different member states, different profiles. And this is also, I think, the challenge of this industry is that it's going very fast, that it's already almost outdated when they try to enforce something. So it's very challenging to also cope with innovation when you have a big body like this, institutional body, that requires a lot of different how do you say implication from different departments, from different profiles. So yeah, it's also a challenge coming from the infrastructure, I think. But it was very nice, Inbar, to have you today on the podcast and to be able to share on those topics and to have your view also from your experience. And I really hope that we will be able to follow you. Let us know where we can get in touch with you if people would like to follow you.
So you can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I've been posting less and less on Twitter. Maybe if you follow me on Blue Sky, I'll have more motivation to post on. But my stories are on MLex at the moment. And Lorena, thank you so much for the work that you do. It's really important to, make sure that women are heard in all these different industries that are so male focused. So, congratulations on all the work that you do. And so
Thank you very much. Thank you, Inbar.
much
It
for
was a
having me.
pleasure.
Pleasure to speak with you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for listening, and we hope you have a nice day. Thanks.